Good afternoon, everyone. I guess we'll get started, and nice to see you here. Today, we'd like to discuss the future of deep ocean observation. That's ocean observation in the open ocean, and in the deep sea, and in the deep water column, so the water that is really beyond national jurisdiction, that often is hard to access and is often expensive to sample. And my name is Anya Waite. I'm the CEO of the Ocean Frontier Institute based at Dalhousie University. And with me, I have a wonderful group of panelists. First, Kendra MacDonald, who's CEO of Canada's Ocean Supercluster. Werner Kutsch, who's Director General of the Integrated Carbon Observation System based in Europe. And Tony Worby, who's Chief Scientist of the Minderoo Foundation based in Australia. And all have a different view on how do we access and how do we harness the importance of the deep ocean. So I think what we're going to do is start with a video, and I will just, so this video, what it does is sets the scene for the work that we're doing at Dalhousie and at the Ocean Frontier Institute on deep ocean carbon work. And it's just a way to open up the discussion and think about what's the flavor of the work that we're doing over the next decade. Oh, I just managed to skip over it. There we go. One moment, please. Okay. Oh, it's happened again. Hold on.
Our planet is teetering toward a climate crisis. Whether you live on the coast or the prairies, in the mountains or in the city, it is the ocean that is most critical for our climate and our future. More than 90% of carbon is stored in the ocean. But emerging science shows the ocean's ability to absorb carbon and regulate temperatures is changing. Changing in ways we don't fully understand. It is a change that is not yet accounted for in climate targets. It is a risk we can no longer afford to take. Without accurate forecasts, it is impossible to set effective climate policies and scale climate solutions. The lack of action now could be devastating to our communities, the economy, and our planet. With a network of partners around the world, the Ocean Frontier Institute has the expertise and the strategy to turn investment into action. 2 initiatives are set to reshape ocean climate action. The Transforming Climate Action Research Program and the proposed North Atlantic Carbon Observatory. The $400 million Transforming Climate Action Research Program is the most intensive investigation ever undertaken into the ocean's role in climate change. This first-of-its-kind research program will take an ocean-first approach to the fight against global warming, to reduce uncertainty by improving our understanding of the changing ocean, mitigate climate change by partnering with industry to develop safe and responsible climate solutions, and develop adaptation solutions to help people thrive as the climate changes. But the world also needs an ambitious and permanent ocean and carbon observing initiative. The strategic place to start is with the North Atlantic Carbon Observatory. The observing system will allow us to measure and predict the ocean's capacity to absorb carbon, information that is needed to improve climate forecasts and scale safe climate solutions. To succeed, nations, scientists, and industry must come together by committing funding, dedicating human resources, and collaborating on solutions. The climate crisis will not wait. We must unite to mobilize industry, nations, and environmental leaders. Transforming Climate Action and the North Atlantic Carbon Observatory will give us the knowledge, innovations, and solutions we need to secure a positive future for you and your community. Learn more and get involved at ofi.ca.
Thanks very much. So we are all trying to upscale to meet the climate challenge, and we're all doing that in different ways. At the Ocean Frontier Institute, as you've just seen, we're building an international research program and putting forward the notion of the North Atlantic Carbon Observatory to move the conversation into targeted action that can really make a difference. There's all sorts of different ways to do this work. And we have 3 panelists today who are doing this kind of ocean work in really, really different ways. So, Kendra, I'd like to start with you. Kendra works on the forefront of innovation. Maybe you can say just a couple of words about Canada's Ocean Supercluster and what they do. But I'd like to hear from you a little bit about what do you think about the future of the ocean, and how does the work you do help us track our climate trajectory?
Sure. So Canada's Ocean Supercluster is one of 5 global innovation clusters really trying to tackle what is a Canadian ecosystem challenge in innovation, which is a lack of industry investment in research and innovation. So that's really what the program was designed for. So we invest in collaborative projects and focus our co-invest with industry in various projects. We've now been around for 5 years, and so we have a portfolio. We've approved over 80 projects and $400 million in project value, and we're just rolling into our second phase. And again, the Ocean Supercluster is really focused on economic growth in the ocean economy, but growing that economy in a digital, sustainable, and inclusive way. And so I think in terms of this conversation and what I've been hearing for the last few days, technology is absolutely critical to the climate journey. And so a lot of what we even already have in our portfolio around particularly sensors and autonomous vessels, especially as you're talking about the deep ocean, to be able to gather the data that we need cost effectively, we're going to need the sensors, we're going to need the uncrewed vessels, and we're going to need the ability to communicate back to be able to collect that data. And then I think we're seeing, so we have a specific focus on ocean AI. So Canada has a lot of strength in artificial intelligence, and we're trying to encourage that community to very quickly come in and work with the ocean community. And I think that's really exciting. So we've approved a number of projects in that space, looking at various ways to be able to, develop algorithms off the data. I think the challenge is then the data, collecting it, cleaning it, annotating it, and so that will be the big challenge as we try to leverage the power of AI.
Great, thanks, Kendra. And Werner, you're working on big observation systems, particularly for carbon, and particularly from the European side. But there's also initiatives like George that go deep into the ocean. How do you see the link between the surface ocean and the deep ocean? How important is that? Oh, I think we'll have some slides for you and a clicker if you want to click through. The bottom arrow is the one. It's
yes.
Not the,
Let me first start with ICOS. ICOS is the integrated carbon observation system, and we are integrated in at least 2 ways. We are integrating 16 European countries at the moment, so it's the model of the European research infrastructure. And the idea is that together we can build something bigger than each country can build by itself. We are also integrated over the different reservoirs. We are doing measurements in the atmosphere, on terrestrial ecosystems, and in the ocean. And in the ocean, we are mainly working on the surface ocean. No,
the second one down, next. Yeah, next.
Oh, okay. We are mainly working in the surface ocean, but we are coordinating a EU project called George. We are naming our projects after the Beatles. We are now at George. And it's called Next Generation for Ocean observations. This is a cooperation with two other research infrastructures. One is EuroArgo, which is the European part of the famous Argo program, which is going from the surface at least 2,000 meters into the ocean. And the third one is EMSO, and this is surface ocean. This is working with fixed station and the ocean grounds. So these three infrastructures cover together the whole ocean, and we have this project that is developing novel technologies, but also an integrated ocean data set, and now a bit out of the graph, training and education. So that's the idea, that we would like to develop together things for a better observatory, and the focus is on autonomous vehicles. So we are, in a way, following the idea of a value chain, let's say it this way. We start with the basic observations, and when we have at the surface at least SOCAT and GLODAP and SOCOM as global data sets, global cooperation, and then as global scientific approaches. And this is then going, of course, the information is going then to IPCC, UNFCCC, and also to ICOS. So we had a lot of ocean information, for example, at the Earth Info Day, and that's the end of the value chain, but there's also some feedback, because we have learned that we need more of these observations. And that's already my set of slides. If you want to know more about George, there is a QR code, but you can also get some brochures at the counter outside. Thank you.
Great, thanks you so much. And George just seems very visionary. Really nice program. So our third panelist today is Tony Worby from the amazing organization, the Minderoo Foundation. And Tony, you spent a lot of time thinking about how to observe the deep sea and the biodiversity there. Why is it important to observe there, and how do you see the trajectory of our investigations in the deep sea?
Yeah, thanks, Anya, and thanks everyone for being here and for the invitation. Minderoo Foundation's an Australian-based philanthropy, and one of our three key beneficiaries is the ocean. And we have a portfolio of work across fisheries and looking at environmental DNA technologies. We also fund a research centre together with the University of Western Australia that's focused on the deep sea. And when we talk deep sea, we're talking Hadal Zone, because we recognise that the Hadal Zone below 6,000 metres depth is absolutely the least observed part of the ocean, and probably the least observed part of the planet. And the reason we've invested in that research centre is because we don't know nearly, that's terrible English, Tony, we don't know nearly enough about the deep sea. And as part of our ocean conservation program, and I don't know if any of you were in the room this morning, we had a session on deep sea mining. We need to know what we're trying to protect. We need to understand the link between the deep ocean and the surface ocean. We need to understand the role and the value and the fragility of deep ocean ecosystems if we're going to protect them. And so we thought it was very important to make that investment into understanding actually what's living in the deep ocean, what's living on the seafloor. We know that those ecosystems take millennia to establish. And we know a lot about the carbon cycle, obviously. We know, I think, as you said in your introduction, Anya, if the carbon's not in the atmosphere, it's in the deep sea and in the sediments. And so over geological timescales, we see the carbon moving between those locations. But it is, at the end of the day, hard to observe the deep ocean. It's cold, it's dark, it's deep, it's intense pressure. And so it does take a lot of commitment, I guess, to really look at what's happening in the deep ocean. I spent most of my research career as a glaciologist / physical oceanographer. And I just wanted to mention that the very first time I went down to Antarctica and into the deep Southern Ocean in 1991, I know I don't look old enough to have been on a ship in 1991, but there I was. We were doing part of a world ocean circulation experiment at the time, and there were a group of scientists on board who were taking the very bottom samples of Antarctic bottom water from several thousand meters depth and looking for CFC 12 and 13. And they were finding, you know, these are CFCs that were put into the atmosphere. We know exactly when they started being put into the atmosphere and when they stopped being put into the atmosphere, and we were able to date the bottom water from those samples because we were finding CFC 12 and 13 in the water samples. And so for me, that was just one of the first times in my career where I really understood the connection between the surface ocean and the deep ocean. Obviously, the meridional circulation, the role that sea ice plays in the polar regions in driving that vertical circulation. But it is so important that we know what's going on in the deep ocean so that it helps put into context everything that's happening at the surface.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. We were just discussing with the World Meteorological Organization is going to be mandating surface ocean observation as part of their Greenhouse Gas Watch, or G3W, and it just reminds us of the connectivity of the ocean because they want surface ocean observations, but today's surface ocean is tomorrow's deep sea, and today's deep sea is tomorrow's surface ocean, which is not, and it's not the same as in the atmosphere. So I think we have some real challenges in the ocean when we're trying to pull together some of these international initiatives, and some of those make assumptions around what the ocean actually, how the ocean interacts with the atmosphere, and so Kendra and Werner, and also we're really talking about an ocean that is globally integrated, that globally integrates what we do. How do you see the kind of work you do and for your particular organization? I know, Kendra, you've thought a lot about the global impact of what the Supercluster does, but how do we integrate and scale the work we're doing? We're from 3 different nations here. There's other nations, obviously. Well, I guess, Werner, if we include the EU, we can as one organization. But of course, the EU has many countries. How do we pull together internationally when we are so regionally focused? I mean, I think about what we do in Canada. We struggle sometimes even to get to the west coast or the north coast of Canada, let alone, in the EU, there's often regional hubs that don't even integrate across Europe, let alone reaching out internationally. And I know that Australia sometimes feels like it's out in the end of the earth, right? So how do we pull that together? I wonder if each of you could just comment a little bit on what are ways, in practical terms, that we can unite what we do and benefit from each other's work.
Yeah, so one of the basic principles of the Supercluster is collaboration. And to your point, when we started, it was, can we get the Atlantic region to collaborate? And then it was, can we get the west and the east coast of Canada to collaborate? Now it is, can we collaborate with the Arctic? Can we collaborate with Indigenous peoples? There's always another element. This is a very big cultural shift in terms of collaboration. One of the speakers, actually probably more than one speaker this week, said, this is such a big problem. No single entity can tackle it. No single country can tackle it. We can't possibly get there without collaboration. But one of the things that we've learned, collaboration is really hard. It is really hard in terms of, truly coming to the table, working with other parties and getting value, making sure that your objectives align and you're getting value out of that collaboration. And so when we go to global collaboration, how do we really develop some tangible outcomes where we can get quick wins, people can feel good coming back to their country, that we're actually learning from each other? Again, what we see is we get these memorandums of understanding where we're going to learn from each other as 2 countries, and then a year goes by and we've barely had a conversation and nothing has really happened. So we've been really trying to focus on, where are the countries where we are truly aligning on sort of where we are, what we're trying to accomplish, how do we actually develop then a tangible thing that we can do together, not 10 things, 1 or 2 things that we can actually do together, and then we can point to that, because I think one of our biggest challenges is global awareness, right? So again, I was at a presentation, they were talking about energy from space, and it's like, but what about the ocean? Before we love talking about space. Space is super exciting, and I'm not saying space is not exciting, but the ocean is incredibly exciting. We need that same sort of excitement, and I think it's a big awareness campaign, and then it's developing tangible things we can do together.
Yeah, I agree. It seems to me that what's really important is to do concrete things and to agree on specific projects that we can work on together so that we can move things forward, because otherwise it continues to be a sort of a hand wave instead of an action. Now, Werner, there's so much going on in the European Union. How can we link better with Canada, between Canada and the EU? That's one question. I mean, Canada has just entered Horizon Europe, which is a wonderful progress for us. We're now part of Horizon Europe, and so now we can actually capitalize on that opportunity and link up. I mean, we've got George, we've got the Transforming Climate Action Program in Canada, and the North Atlantic Carbon Observatory. Do you have a vision about how we could step up and bring these kinds of pieces of work together?
First, I would like to disagree to Kendra, because I think cooperation is easy. Look, here are 3 continents sitting at the stage, talking to each other. I think there are 2 low-hanging fruits, perhaps 3. One is the data sharing, open data. I think every global data set is a progress, and we should work on this. We have the Surface Ocean Carbon Atlas, but we should look what kind of initiative can we have at the deep sea. The second is standardization. I think we can still do a lot in standardizing our observation, which also means that we can service each other when a Canadian vessel comes to a European harbor. Maybe not the technicians from Canada have to fly over, but when we have standards, the European technicians can serve or support. And this is then bringing me to common technical developments, what we are doing in George. There at least we have many European countries, we have the industry, we have the scientists there, and thinking about, for example, common sensors that are possible, common carbon sensors that are possible on autonomous vehicles like gliders, on platforms that you put to the deep sea, and so on and so on. This is something where we also can easily cooperate, and I think we should always start with the low-hanging fruits and then go to the higher ambitions.
Yeah, thanks for that. I would like to step in and say that I agree with both of you, or I disagree with both of you. I think it's both hard and easy, and what we can see is that it's easy to conceptualize, but sometimes hard to do. And for example, the North Atlantic Carbon Observatory has built a collaboration with SOCONET and SOCAT, so the big carbon databases, and we're talking with them about endorsement through GOOSE, so that we can work directly through the Global Ocean Observing System, which I co-chair, and so those kinds of actions. The amount of time that it takes to have those conversations and pull people together and say, this is what we're doing, can you help us, can you endorse us, can you work with us to do that? It's a lot of time and a lot of conversation. And Tony, as I go to you, you and I have talked about working together for, a decade? And yet we're really separated by a couple of ocean basins, and that has really prevented us from joining forces in a couple of areas where we have a lot of common interests. So what are ways to overcome those big sort of geographic divides?
Well, you have to move away from the North Atlantic, Anya.
Okay, fair.
Because I'm in the Southeast Indian Ocean, so but it's like it kind of makes the point, doesn't it? It's I know some people like to say we only have one ocean and it's all connected, and we shouldn't get too hung up about geography. The reality is there's national interest when it comes to funding agencies, there's national interest when it comes to government priorities, and there's national interest, or at least geographic interest, when it comes to organisations like mine. So Minderoo has a strategy that focuses on the Indian Pacific region. We've realised that we can't be everywhere all at once in terms of our geographic focus, and so that's a strategic decision that we've made about where we'll prioritise our investment. I mentioned just before the World Ocean Circulation Experiment, and the reason I'm mentioning it again is because it was a fantastic example of coming up with a strategic plan for global ocean observing that put a whole lot of lines on maps and said, if we're going to really understand how the global ocean circulates, if we're going to understand heat transport and carbon transport and everything else around the ocean, then we need surface to deep sea transects across all of these ocean basins, north, south, east, west, across all of the ocean basins. And the global community basically came together and agreed on that strategy, agreed on where those lines sat on maps. And then we all went to our individual funding agencies and said, this is part of a global plan, we want to fund this transect. And in Australia, we funded transects that ran from Tasmania down to Antarctica and from Perth down to Antarctica, and that closed off a box in the Southern Ocean. And other countries did very similar things. And so it was a fantastic example of global collaboration, but we were all doing our own bit for the greater good, in a sense. And I think, I'm not sure we have that strategic plan for global ocean observing now, and perhaps that's something that Pogo could look at, or Goose could look at. It gets more complicated when you move away from temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, and the very, kind of basic, more physical measurements into, a lot more of the biogeochemistry and what have you. But I think having that global strategy that everybody can buy into is one way to really encourage that global coordination.
I think that's a great comment because one of the things that the Global Ocean Observing System actually sometimes struggles to do is to work at that highest strategic level to pull the international conversation together. And that's what we're trying to do through the Ocean Carbon Exemplar. We're trying to bring together all the ocean carbon chemists who work in this space and have a conversation across the whole community about what needs to happen. And I think there's a really interesting tension that you kind of mentioned, with your quip about the North Atlantic is super well taken, because our argument about the North Atlantic is that it's the place to start, not the place to finish, and that we really have to start with the whole ocean, the global ocean, and then zoom in to one place where we can actually get something done reasonably effectively, and then roll it out, use the experience from that and the understanding from that to roll it out. And I think that the strategic part comes in, where next? So where would you go once you've narrowed the uncertainty in one of the biggest carbon sinks in the world, in the North Atlantic? You might choose the Southern Ocean. You might choose parts of the Indo-Pacific that are so under-sampled that we don't really know anything about what's going on there. And I think, to me, yes, we have one ocean, but only on the scale of 1,000 years. The ocean takes 1,000 years to circulate. So we have embayments on the order of days. We have oceans on the order of months and years, and we have one ocean on the order of 1,000 years. And I think that means that we have to work to translate across all those scales, for sure.
Maybe just a couple of comments building on, since I spoke first. I think, we're co-funding now with Innovate UK, to your point. Now they are able to meet their national objectives. We are able to meet our national objectives, but together we're creating a much richer collaboration because it is across multiple countries. And I think just building on your comment around the data and common data, terminology is not my common data language, like deciding what it's going to look like. We had the North Atlantic UN Decade Conference back in January of 2020, and I was involved with the data, I think it was data transparency stream. And that was one of the number one thing that was raised is how do we get all of this data that we have, how do we agree on how we capture data going forward so that we can be where we want to be by 2030. And part of that discussion was around how do we get to a full digital twin of the ocean by 2030, and we can't possibly do that unless we figure out a way to be able to get all these data sets to feed, to communicate with each other.
So, Kendra, let me hold you on that topic for 1 second. What do you think needs to happen to get that particular task done? Because what you said is, absolutely correct. How do we take that step in practical terms?
I think that the key challenge was who has responsibility for doing that, right? And so, is it the UN Decade, that stream, I think it's stream 6, do they try to do it? And I know there has been discussions around digital twin by 2030, and that was a challenge in the room because you had some organizations that are trying to basically create a huge data. They want to bring all global data together. That's one of their objectives as a not-for-profit. And then you've got others that have little pieces. And so you could see even across the organization, some of them wanted to own that, some of them just wanted to be able to feed into that, but who actually had the because we're talking global, who actually had the responsibility to say, how do we all come together like we do with plugs? Like, how do we all come together and decide that this is going to be our standard for data, and we want you to capture these minimum things so that these data sets can talk together? And I haven't heard I think, again, we're having ongoing workshops, but I don't know that we've gotten to a place to say, and we're now 3 years from that conversation, to say we've now agreed this is how we're going to do it going forward.
Yeah, and I guess there's also lots of data sets that are around and not integrated into some of the big the observation systems. I always remember when one of the big hurricanes hit Nova Scotia, there was all this discussion that there were moorings and sensors and gliders in the ocean that were making critical measurements just where under the hurricane track, and those measurements weren't pulled together into the data and weather systems because they didn't know that each other existed. So Werner, did you want to comment a little bit on data specifically, or did you have something else you wanted to share?
No, I wanted to comment on data because I think there are solutions on the way. One purpose of ICOS is that we are streaming all our data through a so-called thematic center for quality checks, and then to our so-called carbon portal, where they can be downloaded free and openly. And this is a lot of technology behind it. There's also, of course, data tracking. We have DOIs, we have landing pages that the data can be cited, which is very important for the data producers, and so on and so on. And this is building up stepwise trust that data sharing is not giving data away to somebody who grabs it and then writes the nature paper instead of me and not citing me. And I think it's more than that. It's also a necessity that where we really can and should cooperate. I think we are in the 21st century. The technology is there. We have rich metadata. We can easily collect data from different sources, and so on and so on. So the technology, the data technology is there. We still have to work among us scientists on the willingness to do that.
That's right. And there's a whole industry around writing peacemaking software between different databases to make sure that they can communicate with each other. So, yeah. Tony, did you want to comment on data?
Sure. It's not my strong point, but I am very familiar with the Integrated Marine Observing System. I know you know that, Anya. It's a program within Australia. It's funded by the Australian government, and it is... I'm going to guess at the numbers, but probably a $10 to $12 million a year investment in research infrastructure in the marine environment from the Australian federal government that has probably been running now, I'm going to say it's close to 20 years. It's probably not quite 20 years. It treats the data itself as a national asset. It funds mooring work, it funds gliders, it funds coastal radars, a whole lot of different observing capabilities around the entire coastline of Australia. It co-invests alongside state governments. It has, over time, moved closer into the coast and some of the coastal observing needs that industry might have, for example. And I think part of its success, because you've got hard-nosed bureaucrats sitting in Canberra reviewing this program every 5 or 6 years and really asking, why do we keep funding these marine scientists to keep collecting this data? What is it all for? And I think ICOS has been very good at recognising that data, and this goes to your question about the hurricane, that data needs to be turned into products, and the products need to be turned into information that delivers an impact for society, for the community. And I think from a researcher perspective, and I put myself in this category, I'm sure we've all collected a lot of data. We've written our paper, and then the paper gets published. Some people read it, some people cite it. But the data may or may not go into a national database, and it may or may not be turned into a useful product that is ultimately going to deliver some benefit to society. And I think if you put your mindset, you put your mind in kind of the space of how does the data we collect deliver impact, and how do we put it into a format that people find useful? I find it frustrating when I look at the local weather report now that there's not a synoptic chart, because I know how to read a synoptic chart. Turns out most people don't. And so our Weather Bureau has stopped publishing synoptic charts because it's actually not a useful form of information for 99% of the population who haven't got a degree in meteorology, right? Annoys me, but they know who their audience is. And if you're planning a barbecue on the weekend, there's no point publishing a synoptic chart for 99% of the population. So now you get a forecast that says there's this percentage chance of rain at this time of the day. You can almost see it hour by hour, and people love that, right? That's information that's presented to them in a way that they can absorb. And I think when we talk about observing infrastructure, yes, it serves the research community. I think we also have to be very cognizant of the fact that we're spending public money in most cases, and we should be thinking about how we deliver a public benefit from that. And the more we think in that mindset, I think the greater the chances that you attract the big dollars, not just in a single grant, but in a more consistent way from government.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. That's a great point about really needing to deliver. I think that does, though, bring up a really big question around how do we observe the deep sea? And how do we observe the open ocean that are beyond national jurisdiction and that don't actually have those instant deliverables that we do when we observe the coastal zone? I think that highlights the challenge, because most of us get our livelihood from the coastal zone, but the actual climate challenge and the climate trajectory is controlled by the open and deep ocean, which is underobserved. And so refocusing there makes it is very tricky. And I think we need to do a few calisthenics to kind of make those arguments so clear to our policymakers that they will be happy to jump in and invest. And I would say to date they haven't. To the extent we want. There have been those, the nice programs like the Argo floats that go globally, but those are now declining in real terms. So my question to you next, and it's not on the script, so I'm sorry, but it seems like we've kind of come to this point.
No, this is on the script.
Right. So who should be paying? Right. So we have a lot more conversations now with private sector actors, with philanthropy, with others. Who should be paying for the open ocean observation that nations won't very easily convert into a weather forecast? And just as one example, when the WMO endorsed and mandated nations to deliver meteorological data to the UN, and they do that, and nations have to do it. They have to deliver those data. Everybody thinks that that's a magic bullet, that mandate, because you can see how important weather data are for everybody. And so everybody is delivering those data. Now, the problem is when the WMO starts to mandate ocean carbon observations, that's all very well, but we don't have the same natural understanding of why ocean carbon observations are important for the world. And so I think there's a disconnect between the real importance of ocean observation to the world and the kind of understanding and willingness. So who should be paying, and are there data products from open ocean work that could light a fire under a policymaker to get them to fund them?
Maybe my answer is a bit philosophical. When we are looking at in particular the ocean carbon, it's part of the global carbon system. And yesterday or 2 days ago, the Global Carbon Project gave its 23 data. And then you have this graph, ocean sink. And everybody's happy, 25% of the emissions, the fossil fuel emissions go to the ocean. Whether it's 25 or 27 or 23, it doesn't matter. We know there is a lot of carbon going. And we are communicating this in this way, which I more and more think is wrong. Because just seeing the ocean as the garbage bin for fossil fuel emissions is perhaps not the right view on the ocean. The CO2 that is dissolved in the ocean is harming the ocean. We have coral bleaching perhaps as the most prominent part, but there are many, many other negative effects on this. And this is in a way coming back one day. So it's the harm on the ocean is something we should perhaps look closer to. It should be part of our observations as well. And weather forecast is for the next 3 days. I think ocean observations are for the next 3 decades or for the next 3 centuries even. So we have to know what's going on in the ocean and what are the risks, what are also the risk when we are one day reducing the carbon in the atmosphere again. It might all come back from the ocean. We don't know. We simply don't know. And all these risks should be observed. I think that's a good practice. When you see a risk, you should observe it. And well, I'm not so much a friend of the industry stepping in because they have their own interests. I think it's public money that should go in, and well, perhaps we could relate it to the emissions of a country or whatever. But I think there is a necessity to have an observatory, a comprehensive observatory that is based on public money.
So an emissions tax that goes into ocean observation. That's a great idea. And it started here. You've all heard it here first. Yeah, that's great. Tony, did you want to comment?
Yeah, so I mentioned that we fund a deep sea research centre in conjunction with the University of Western Australia, and as part of that we have put some observatories in the Perth Canyon, which is just off the coast of Western Australia. So that's a philanthropically funded research centre. You know, we put basically $1 million a year in over 5 years. The university has leveraged that significantly from other philanthropic investments. So the whole centre actually has thrived with philanthropic money. It's not going to last forever, and so you know, certainly the academics in that centre need to be now, you know, starting to think about applying for grants and attracting public money into that centre. But it's given them an amazing head start, and it's given them an amazing opportunity to fund some ship time, hire a bunch of postdocs, put some observatories out into the Perth Canyon. Now, the reason we're interested in that I touched on at the very beginning, but the observatory work in the Perth Canyon is very focused on the fact that A, we don't know anything about our own backyard. We have a founder who's deeply passionate and interested in that space. But we also know that there's, you know, the heads of canyons are very biologically diverse, important ecosystems. And at the moment, that area is not declared as a marine park in Australia. There's a lot of fishing that happens in that area at the head of the canyon. We would love to see it declared as a marine park, but we also know that unless we have data that can demonstrate just how important that area is, then we have no case to go to the federal government when all of the marine parks come up for review in 2028. So our plan is we want a marine park in that area, and so we're prepared to invest in the science that will help us make the case for it. So that's philanthropic money, but it's invested in a way that we believe will help us exert pressure for the greater good and help us get our ducks lined up and make the case. I agree that, sustained observatories, they really need to be public money. You will always attract, or there's always the potential to attract some philanthropic money but the case for long-term sustained observing, I think, is a case for governments to consider. They're always going to look at the opportunity cost of every single investment that they make. And so, I think that means that, the proposals have to be sharp, and you've got to be really clear about what questions you're trying to answer and what the public benefit of answering those questions is. And that it's not an academic curiosity, which I know it's not, but it can't look like that either. So
That's interesting. Kendra, we can talk a little bit maybe about should industry pay for part of this, and why. And I'll just, as a presage to that question, we've done some work with The Economist in collaboration with NOAA, where we've been trying to track the abundance of public and private ocean data. And it's really clear right now that there's potentially way more private data out there than there is public data. And I think that's a big challenge, because obviously industries have their own needs and wishes of what they want to do with that. But it's also a huge opportunity if you're operating collaboratively with industry. I wonder, Kendra, if you have a comment about, is there a way to bring private and public together, and what's the role of the private sector in this kind of work?
Yeah, so I do think that the private sector has to play a role. I think it's really key to this conversation. Again, going back to that workshop that we had, there is a tremendous amount of data that organizations have collected. In some cases, they've agreed not to share it for 50 years. So one of the conversations that we had was, how do we actually get greater sharing of data when you've got a service provider that has collected data on your behalf? Could they possibly be able to share that more broadly? I think, a lot of the discussions over the last few days have been around companies, and especially companies that are transporting or shipping using marine transportation, big distribution companies. And so they are all looking at how they move to net zero. And so part of that is figuring out how they are impacting ocean. And so how do we get them to understand? There's just such a tremendous amount of storytelling required for this. Tony, your comment around how do we help the public understand the science? And that's part of helping the private companies, right? We've got increasing impact investors. They're trying to figure out how to have impact. And they don't necessarily understand the link to this, but I think if they did, they would put more money in. Is it for long-term observation? Maybe not, but is it in the development of the technology? We need to accelerate the development of the technologies that are going to allow us to collect the data to be able to do the long-term observation too. Maybe that's where they can play, is to be able to focus there more. There was a philanthropist that was recently in Portugal, and he said, we have this huge natural asset beyond regulated borders, and we treat it like it's free, and we don't respect it, and there's no requirement to respect it. And so how do we, I don't have the answer, maybe making a philosophical comment as well, how do we actually hold all nations more accountable and all companies more accountable for their use? And I think, there is an appetite definitely for impact investing in blue. I just think they just don't understand it. And so they don't understand where their money would be best, have the most impact in ocean.
So it comes down to really communication issues across all of this. Are there any questions in the audience that people would like to share with us? Julie.
This has been a fascinating panel. Thanks so much. I'm curious what I'm hearing. One of the threads in the conversation is this tendency toward purpose-driven observing, and I'd be curious to hear, especially the ones that you all engaged in that. So that's Anya, Werner, Tony. What are the end uses that are most top of mind for you when you think of this shift to more purpose-driven beyond academic research? And then two specific follow-on questions, one for Kendra. I'd love for you to share more around the ocean and AI use cases that you're seeing, some of the challenges that you mentioned, if you could share a bit more about that. And then Werner, around a question around the autonomous vehicles and the role of startups or businesses in catalyzing that innovation. Is that in the plan for George? Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Julie. That's going to get us to the end of our time, I think. Remind me what that first one was again? The purpose-driven. So, I mean, to me, the first greater purpose is climate projections. We don't know anything about the future of the climate unless we understand the trajectory of the ocean. But then MCDR, so marine carbon dioxide removal, is probably the most obvious place where we urgently need to get that ocean baseline really tight so that these industries are kind of compelled to measure their perturbations against a real ocean baseline, not the ocean baseline they assume is there or that is practical for them to use. And so I think those two, for me, are the really big ones. Yeah. I don't know. Tony, if you had...
Maybe one short comment. I would love to observe the ocean carbon cycle just from an academic point of view as research. But we have a problem. And the problem is the global carbon cycle, including atmosphere and land ecosystems. And we have raising CO2 in the atmosphere and climate change. And we have to understand that. And that's the purpose. So if we are not understanding the ocean carbon cycle fully, there's always a big uncertainty and risk in the global climate research. So it's an active service that we are providing to the whole community, let's say it this way. About the autonomous vehicles, we have in the George project, we have about 6 or 7 industrial partners. So these are either industry partners who are working on specific sensors. And for autonomous vehicles, you need small sensors, you need sensors that don't have a big energy consumption and things like that. And they're trying to get these sensors on a readiness level that they can really be sold globally. That's, I think, also one idea. The second part is platforms, like gliders, but also like these deep sea platforms, where you then can integrate the sensors. And that's also a challenge in many ways. And I think the exchange between the scientists and these industrial partners is really exciting.
So I'll just pick up on the industry piece. So actually, I'll come to the industry piece. There's, so as part of the Integrated Marine Observing System program that I talked about, there's a lot of observations of sea surface temperature around Australia. All of that data is used for lots of different scientific purposes. We also had a scientist at CSIRO decide that you could actually also make that information really useful for yachties, and as in people who are out there on the ocean, yacht racing, and started to create some amazing products that are particularly picked up every Christmas when there's a major blue water yacht race from Sydney to Hobart. And it got to the point where actually we had a CSIRO scientist go and brief at the very start of the Sydney-Hobart yacht race on where the eddies are up and down the east coast of Australia, so that this information could be really adequately used by... And that yacht race is watched by millions of people all around the world. So there's a lot... So, you know, the reason for collecting that data had nothing to do with boating, had nothing to do with yachting, but it was a way of taking a product to the general community and adding an enormous value, I would say, to that data. It's also provided enormous value to the aquaculture industry up and down the east coast of Australia to make that data available. Similarly, there was we have some national reference stations around the coast, and when there's been significant changes when those coastal observations were affected by a lot of stream runoff, and you saw a decrease in salinity in those areas, that was also an important signal to coastal aquaculture that, you know, there was a potential, you know, algal bloom situation, for example, that they had to take precautionary measures. So there are all of these ways to make data that that might be collected for quite an academic purpose, valuable to the public, to industry. And once you start to understand what some of those applications are, kind of the sky's the limit a little bit, because you might not have to tweak a lot of those observing systems very much in order to really deliver a huge amount of benefit for a much broader audience.
Great. I think we're coming to the end of our time today, and I'd just like to thank our speakers enormously for your input. I think we all have identified huge challenges in going forward, but also the enormous benefits that we can gain if we're all able to work together across basins, across technologies, and across nations. So thank you all for coming today and for giving us your time, and thanks to the audience. And we'll close. Thank you.